What I want to look at this afternoon is, I suppose, something about the nature of Corbynism, even to sort of use that idea, what's left of it, maybe where it came from and where it's going, but maybe also to talk about it in terms of the official Labour left, and indeed the Labour left, the wider Labour left, and indeed the nature of Labourism, and I suppose the socialist movement, the working class movement, the Labour movement in Britain. Um, I suppose I don't need an exhaustive sort of narrative about what happened, and but looking back over in preparation for the talk, I revisited some of the books and some of the articles that were written about Jeremy Corbyn, indeed what became known as the Corbyn movement in the period from about 2015, 2016, well into 2020, after the election defeat, and indeed the election of Keir Starmer as Labour leader. And they all came from sort of different positions, different approaches. And I felt that although they all were of some merit, they hadn't really captured the full nature of this movement. And I suppose the question I kept on asking myself was whether this was in some ways a sort of unique movement, or whether it could be related to other movements that were going on internationally, particularly in Europe and North America, or how it could relate to earlier forms of Labour leftism. The other thing that interested me, and this is, I suppose, more of a research agenda. I don't want to be too academic, and it's always an accusation that can be raised. But I was also interested in the relationship between Corbyn as a leader and as a politician, and his particular type of politics, and the trajectory of that movement. In some ways, I almost thought, as I was reading this, that the better way to do it would be to turn this into almost an Elizabethan or Jacobean style play, the tragical history of Master Jeremy Corbyn, wherein his rise and downfall is explained, and to sort of see it as a sudden rise and then a precipitate fall. And maybe, as many people have done, even comrades on the left, to both see him as a figure who was almost a saintly figure, who was assailed by the right wing, by the capitalist media, by enemies within, and then brought down, sort of nobleman at bay, who tried to do the right thing, tried to be a socialist leader, only to be assailed on all sides. And indeed, if any comrades have ever tried to discuss this issue in the broader sections of the Labour left, what often happens is that any criticisms of Corbyn as a leader, and indeed of his period, often is people turn on you quite viciously. And even though you might try to say, well, look, we need to discuss what happened here, why events took the way that they did, there's still almost a sort of idea that you're letting the side down, even worse, that you're joining in, that you're amongst the circle of conspirators or the mob that sort of kicked him to death in the last days. The other set of arguments, though, and again, I think quite widespread, is that in a way this was all a set of individual failings, and that Corbyn's own personality, maybe his own political personality, was the sort of original sin. And I think that's a more interesting way of looking at it, partly because I think that Jeremy Corbyn does represent a specific type of Labour leftism, but he's also in many ways quite typical of the wider sections of the Labour left. And I say that as someone who spent the bulk of the political activity as part of that Labour left. And so I sort of recognise the failings, and indeed some of the quite major political problems in the approach of the Labour left, and of Corbyn in particular. So I want to try to look at those I want to try to look at those issues here, and I hope comrades can, can discuss this. It's a shame that Tina Werkman isn't present, because Tina was involved in, some areas of the Labour left in this period. But I'm afraid she's still in Germany due to a family bereavement, and so can't join us. But I am going to try to bring in some of my own personal experiences, not because I think they're, unique, but I think they are illuminating in trying to function in that area, but also to try to, in many ways, I tried to make sense of events as they were going on. And, the political position I've currently arrived at actually is a response to that. Many comrades in this meeting may well have had a fairly clear idea of their politics going into the Corbyn period. I thought I had, but I'm now convinced that I shared many of the weaknesses. By the way, this is not a collective criticism session. So I know, Anne, you went to confession, and I'm not doing this publicly before the comrades. But I did find, looking back over this period, really quite interesting to look at my own reactions to it and to think of how other people on the left had dealt with it. So let's sort of perhaps begin at the beginning, or certainly the election of Corbyn as Labour leader, 2015, a surprising election. We all know the stories that he was almost pushed into it, that the campaign group was looking for a candidate. People were notoriously reluctant to do it, sort of a Buggins turn, and then Corbyn was almost the last one to leave the room. Again, these are the sort of stories. I don't really have any reason to doubt them. And they then went looking for nominees. A few so-called idiots, in the words of Margaret Beckett, which includes herself, signed his nomination papers, and he was on the ballot. And then, surprise, surprise, gets elected. The word surprise is, I think, important here. If we think of the fortunes of the Labour left from, say, the early 1990s up until 2015, what I think we would see that this really did, I think, come out of the blue. I would be interested, and particularly for comrades who had been continuously active in that period, if anybody can remember anybody predicting some sort of revival of the Labour left. Indeed, most of the left groupings, I'm thinking of groups like the Socialist Party, who as militant had been, fairly clearly committed to work in the Labour Party. But most comrades on the left had more or less ruled out any revival of the Labour left. And indeed, in the case of the Socialist Party and others on the left, had argued that Labour had now become a completely bourgeois workers' party, a completely bourgeois party, and that, that the links with the trade unions were now fairly strained, and that any growth of a mass left wing could be ruled out. And indeed, that argument was one which the leadership of the Labour Party took to heart. They didn't foresee the rise of a mass left wing, and that they believed, which again shows you something of their own politics. They believed that if they adopted almost a sort of American primary style of internal election, of more or less throwing the election of the leader and indeed other MPs, it was being rumoured this would happen, over to wide sections of the population, that this mass of sensible electors would prevent the rise of any extremists. So the argument was that if you made membership, joining the party, a fairly easy activity, I think at that point you just had to pay £3 and sign up and you were in, and that gave you a vote, that this would bring in floods of sensible people who would automatically back moderate, sensible policies. Now, what happened was, in fact, the reverse, and I was one of those people who played their £3. This was just sort of too good a chance not to have a go at the Labour right. And, I took it rather in the way, I have to say, and a lot of people I knew who did this rather in the way that you might see something online which invites you to, are you for or against the monarchy? And you put it in, and you hope that you're going to get a majority on this online poll, but you don't expect very much out of it. And I know a number of people who did that. And of course, the surprise was that not only did large numbers of people join the party, at one point, the membership in this period between 2015 2019 reached about 500,000, but also that they voted for Corbyn. And indeed, in that period, particularly the hustings and some of the meetings, it was very clear that a sort of groundswell of opinion was moving towards Corbyn. Some of those hustings were televised. Again, I think comrades will remember seeing those hustings and seeing the response that Corbyn's, fairly, I suppose it seemed radical in comparison with the wooden Labour right-wing types that they had up, but it was hardly, a call for world revolution. But it went down very well in that way. So in many ways, the rise of Corbyn was, I think, quite unexpected. And the big question then was, well, who was voting for Corbyn, and why were they doing it? This is where, looking back over both the press reports and some of the books, that I found that the journalistic accounts were in many ways quite inadequate. And I think this then became mirrored in some of the attempts to write longer books, pretty well instant history. It was very clear that Corbyn had struck something of a chord with younger people who'd been involved in, say, the student movement, particularly around the fee question, but also around other sort of single issue or protest politics, various wars, climate, and so forth. But I think it was also quite interesting in my own experience when those of us who'd sort of signed up now thought, well, let's sort of try and do something more than just vote for somebody, but let's go to some meetings and let's see what this left is all about. To find quite a number of people who were not, the student radicals so beloved of media, but were often quite a wide section of the population, and indeed, not just young hotheads. Many of them were actually quite old and middle-aged hotheads as well. There were there were a number of sort of public meetings and interventions developing in Liverpool, and there were people there that I hadn't seen in 20 or 30 years coming back into politics. And indeed, this was, I think, noteworthy that nationally, that there was something of a revival of an existing left which had been dormant for some time and had been active in the movement at different levels in that way. The other feature, I think, of this movement, and it's one that I think explains some of its weaknesses, was that its politics were, I think, primarily sort of oppositional. All politics are oppositional in one sense, and opposition to capitalism, is a valid starting point. But I think it was more a rejection of Blairism and of the type of explicitly pro-capitalist politics without having, I think, a very clear sort of sense of direction. And I think this was, again, partly reflected the weakness of the Labour left historically. Again, if we go back into the 70s and 80s, when in both parliamentary and trade union and membership terms, the left was quite a strong grouping, quite a strong current. Much of that left was either influenced ideologically by the official Communist Party, both through the unions and through the politics of what is in effect the British road to socialism, the alternative economic strategy. So there was a type of Labour leftism of that sort, which was often it had fundamental inadequacies, which I will talk about. But what it did do was to give a fairly structured set of left positions inside the Labour Party. The other elements which had sort of hung around were other organisations of the official left, the Campaign for Labour Party Democracy, which had been functioning to democratise Labour, had continued with its campaigning work, but had now, I suppose, ossified into a fairly small grouping that attempted to get resolutions through party conference, but had become pretty marginalised in that way. But the other forces on the Labour left, which had survived or had started to emerge, and when this new wave sort of moves into the Labour Party, begins to encounter them, was of course the Socialist Campaign Group, which had been started in the early 80s as representative of the left of the Parliamentary Labour Party. This is indeed where Corbyn had, launched his leadership campaign. And that had dwindled. Its membership was around about 20, but I suspect that it may even have fallen further in real terms. And this acted again as a sort of rather, marginal grouping, of which people like John McDonnell and Corbyn were, well, certainly McDonnell were leading members. With the departure of Benn from Parliament, the official left didn't have much of a major standard bearer, and indeed, it was quite possible when Corbyn stood for election to rather ridicule him and in a sense almost see it as a bit of a joke to put him up, just to demonstrate how weak the left really was. But the other new development, which again was to have some significance, but shows, I suppose, something of the character of this left, was the emergence of Momentum. Comrades who were reading the Weekly Worker or indeed following Labour left politics in this period will know quite a lot about the nature of Momentum, and indeed much of the debate going on inside Corbynism, as it were, was about how to organise and what the nature of that organisation should be. And comrades who grouped around Labour Party Marxists were constantly pushing for democratisation of that grouping, which in effect was a sort of social media operation initiated by John Landsman. And it used all of the sort of modern techniques of acquiring large amounts of data, in a way not unlike the sort of points that Yasmin made yesterday about commercial companies. So it acquired details of you, and then was able to send messages and to organize that, for example, in party conferences and meetings. It was also to prove, I think, quite effective in ensuring that certain candidates, particularly in national elections or in party elections, would have a sort of basis of support. So as such, it was really quite an effective tool, but it was also quite an effective tool for machine politics. And it acquired a sort of kudos. It almost acquired the sort of mythical reputation of being a sort of sinister hand behind the scenes, and in the bourgeois media in particular, making great play on the ability of Momentum to get motions through conference, of messages being used to coordinate activities. It would be almost as it would have been in the early modern period. It was a bit like the Jesuits, the hidden hand pulling the strings, as it were, or other sinister forces. I think why I talk about this is that in a way it shows some aspects of the Labour left. It shows that that even this movement, which looks initially quite amorphous, as indeed it was, but there are organisations and there are structures working within it. And again, I'll try to talk a little more about their politics in a while. I want to perhaps return now to look at what we might think of as the politics of Corbynism and where it stands in relation to the official Labour left. And to sort of return to that question about whether it was a sort of new movement, whether this was really the radical sort of democratic movement, the equivalent reflected in British terms of, say, Podemos, or the Sanders movement, or indeed of any other of those sort of movements that rose and fall very quickly, in the 21st century. Now, in some ways, it did have that character, and I suppose this does tell us something about the nature of the politics of our period. A comrade speaking earlier this week referred to the sort of shallowness of the left and the weakness of the left, and I would agree with that. And the nature of this movement as a focus of leftism was incredibly shallow, and indeed, other than having sort of oppositional tendencies towards previous Labour leaders and their politics, particularly Blairism, it was, it lacked a very clear coherence. That's why I made the comparison, say, with the alternative economic strategy of the Labour left of the 1970s and 80s, and in particular the sort of organizational forms that were given to that Labour left in that period. But I do think that we can cite Corbynism within Labour leftism. And for that, I think we need to understand something both about Labour leftism and the nature of, indeed, the Labour Party. One of the sort of problems that Labour leftists like me always had to sort of work through was to try to understand quite well, one, what we were doing with the Labour Party. And, for many people, it was always a case of lesser evilism. Labour governments might not be much good, but they were always better than the Tories. But also, there was, I suppose, a widespread idea almost of incremental politics, that various forms of social change could occur incrementally, through legislation, and that, Labour would be one of the means of doing that. And that position, although it's, an explicitly reformist position, was in many ways held by many people, even who might well have considered themselves on the far left of Labour. But I think what there also was, and this was both strong in groups that were organised and also formally were revolutionary. I mean, the militant groups probably one example of this. The argument that a Labour government would not only could not only be a vehicle for the development of socialism, but even when under the control of the right, it could be pressurized. And the argument was, and again, I think there's validity in the argument about how the processes might work, that Labour, as a bourgeois workers' party, does have connections, or deep organic connections, to the working class, and that Labour has to be accounted for and has to be dealt with in whatever ways. In other words, that we cannot simply sort of ignore Labour, we cannot simply declare it dead. And the experience of Corbynism, I think, showed that its connections as a bourgeois workers' party still give it that connection. And now that meant that for many Labour leftists, the be-all and end-all was the Labour government. And indeed, in some of the arguments, this incremental strategy was one of getting left-wing MPs, of building a strong left wing, and then getting into Parliament, and in that way challenging state power, either using legislative power or through a combination of parliamentary and extra-parliamentary activity. Now, these politics were held on wide sections of the Labour left in the 70s and 80s, but I think by the 2000s, other than a few small groups, Socialist Appeal would probably still in their propaganda, and this is before they discovered communism, would still be arguing for Labour to power on a socialist programme. And so those sorts of ideas on the Labour left were quite widespread. But I think with Corbynism, as incoherent as those ideas were, Corbynism was in many ways even less coherent on this point. The other aspect of Corbynism, why I think it does need to be regarded as part of the official Labour left and not some sort of new form that's almost an aberration, is its relationship to the Labour Party as an organisation and its nature. If we think of the history of the Labour left, going back, right to the beginning of the party, it always saw its place as being legitimate within the party. In other words, that it was as legitimate a current within the party as anybody else. The Labour right, the openly pro-capitalist, often, indeed frequently, generally, often portrayed the left as is in many ways illegitimate, as infiltrators. At various points, they would argue, though, they were communists, and indeed in the 20s and 30s, many of them were. But they always made great play on their legitimacy as Labourites. And they pointed, again, comrades will remember that when the witch hunts began in the 80s, that many militant people, and indeed other Labour leftists, pointed back not only to their own records of long service in the Labour Party, but would point back to the foundation of Labour and argue that the presence of the SDF meant that Marxism and leftism was an integral part of the Labour Party. So from that, the politics of the official Labour left were always those of the official Labour left. In other words, they had a sanctioned place within Labourism. And although it might well be, it could on occasions be left, it could be very radical, it could at periods talk about extra-parliamentary activity. It could even, in the case of some comrades, argue that the Labour government, if faced with the challenges of the bourgeois state, should move outside of parliamentary norms and so on. But essentially, it still remained within that Labourist framework, and it still argued for the continuation of the Labour Party and indeed of Labourist politics. It also is important to note that as a bourgeois workers' party, Labour does have, I suppose, a different character to many equivalent parties of its type, particularly in Europe, in that many of those parties began their lives as either communist parties or indeed social democratic parties. But Labour began not just as a representative party of the trade unions with some socialist affiliations, but it did begin with the aim of representing the interests of the working class within the confines of bourgeois society. And indeed, it isn't until 1918 when it develops that Fabian constitution, the Labour and the New Social Order and Clause 4, the one which Socialist Appeal regarded as the acme of socialism only a couple of years ago when they were still, as I say, playing the role of Labour leftists. So that Labourism was very much a party that worked in the interests of the working class in Parliament and within the confines of the current state. It was loyal to the existing constitutional order. It had never, for example, had any revolutionary origins. It couldn't point to anything of the character of the SPD. It couldn't point to any arguments about the socialist transformation of society. It was Labourist, and even when we look at Clause 4 and Labour and the New Social Order, it was essentially a framing of the transformation of capitalism and the management of capitalism. So official left Labourism, even at its most radical phases, still operated within that framework, I think, ideologically and politically. But I think there's another element of official Labourism which is important, and is the preservation of the Labour Party, and indeed the reluctance, not only reluctance, but the opposition to really taking the fight to the Labour right and to the pro-capitalist. And this is where I think that Corbynism, particularly at its leadership level, really can be, its character as part of the official left can be really seen. Comrades will be familiar with the argument. It's one that certainly goes back into the 50s when the anti-Bevanite campaign and the attacks on the left reached a particular intensity. And the response of Bevanites, and I think it was Wilson who came up with the phrase, but I think Ben later used it, was to argue that Labour as a party was like a bird that required two wings to fly, a left wing and a right wing. And this again started from the sort of basis of the legitimacy of the left, that it had a rightful place in the Labour Party. But I think that when Corbyn assumed the leadership and was potentially in a much stronger position, he took that argument, which might well have been a justification from a position of weakness, and he used it as an argument when potentially he was in a much stronger position. And this, I think, is perhaps where the compromising and the cowardice, I will use that word, and the utter uselessness of the Labour left, I think does come to light. And I think it isn't just a sort of a personal or an individual characteristic, but I think it's something which is, really quite fundamental. Again, comrades will be aware of Corbyn's response to the attacks upon him and on the left in general. The anti-Semitism smear campaign, I think, we don't need to dwell on that, but we do need to remind ourselves, and it is important, to really bang this one home, that when Corbyn was leader, when he'd appointed, Jenny, I can never remember her second name, the General Secretary after Ian McNichol, that far from winding down the witch hunt, he'd actually stepped up. And if you remember in the various reports and in the various attempts to justify his leadership, Corbyn argued that the campaign against anti-Semitism had in fact been intensified under his leadership. And I think comrades, again, probably don't need reminding, but it is useful to remind people in the movement more widely that when the Labour right, the pro-capitalist right, attacked him, as they did, attempting to undermine him both in the Parliamentary Labour Party and elsewhere, that far from going on the offensive against them, he made numerous concessions, he made numerous retreats, or, and again, in this, all contributing to this sort of rather martyr image, he sailed on with his head in the air, ignoring all around him. And this, I think, is not just a sort of personality trait. This is not just somebody who is not willing to be nice to people, not to be unpleasant to people, to be to simply let the matter pass. That I will rise above this. This, I think, is a political weakness, and the political weakness is recognizing or failing to recognize that the Labour right, the pro-capitalist right, are not just comrades who are slightly misguided, but are actually representatives of the ruling class inside the workers' movement. And that what we need is not just debate, is not just resolutions, but we actually need to purge our movement of these pro-capitalists. And this, I think, was the real failure in terms of Corbynism. That we know that in the event of a Corbyn government being elected, we know that if Labour had won a majority in 2019, again, I think that would have been very unlikely. But if it had happened, then the likelihood of Corbyn being called to the palace to form a government would have been exceptionally low. That comrades know the constitutional position. It would be Her Majesty, as it then was, would call somebody who could command a majority in the House of Commons. And the composition of the Parliamentary Labour Party in 2019, and indeed even moreover in 2017, would not have enabled that to happen. Starmer probably would have been called and Corbyn would have been sidelined. And for all the huffing and puffing, no preparation had been made to talk about that possibility, because the idea of everybody being Labour and everybody being united was the essence of Corbynite politics in that way. I could give numerous examples of where, for example, party activists in this city, in Liverpool and elsewhere, were attempting to take the fight to the right, particularly those MPs who later went over, left the Labour Party and joined that, wherever that new grouping was, who later stood against Labour in elections. And when, officials from Corbyn's office, John McDonnell personally and others, telephoned and contacted comrades on the left and would, more or less ordered them not to deselect or not to pursue, the right in this way. So I think that weakness is not, I think, a personal failing. It's a structural failing in terms of their leftism. And above all, it's a leftism that wants to preserve Labour, albeit a left wing and a modified left Labour, but still essentially a Labour Party in that way. The Labour left, of which the upper echelons of Corbynism, very quickly formed a part. And I'm thinking here of Momentum leaders. I'm thinking also of many of the elements who came into the party in this period, in the sort of Corbyn wave, who very quickly gained council positions. Some even became parliamentary candidates, and very quickly found themselves part of the party machinery. But far from using that machinery then to, begin an outright attack on the Labour right, simply accommodated themselves. And again, we can think of plenty of examples of that sort of person operating in local government, and indeed even now getting ready to be Labour candidates in the next general election. Now, again, this is not a set of moral failings. This is not about some sort of iron law of oligarchy or, the corruption of bourgeois politics. But what I think it does tell us is about the nature of their politics, which are essentially those of parliamentary careerism. And I wouldn't downplay the degree to which careerism and indeed the possibilities of advancement weren't important factors after the sort of first wave of Corbynism peaked. and more importantly, after the possibilities of using leftism, particularly in conjunction with trade union bureaucrats, to gain a position in the party. And this again is where the Labour left isn't, I think, just politically wrong in terms of its understanding of the nature of socialism, and indeed of developing socialist politics, but also sees its role as part of a Labour bureaucracy, of maintaining that bureaucracy, particularly in relation to the trade union leadership, which again Corbyn used on any number of issues in Labour Party conferences in order to head off any movements to the left, particularly on issues of reselection and party democracy. And indeed, the absorption of this Labour left into the trade union and the Labour bureaucracy, I think, is a significant feature. So I want to try and sort of conclude by looking at, what's left of Corbynism. I think it still exists. It exists still in the Labour Party, although the party's membership has fallen. There still is something of a left within it, not just in the handful of Socialist Campaign Group MPs, but also in its ranks. But perhaps more importantly, outside the party, either because of expulsions or because of resignations, there is a broad current that would, I think, have been brought into activity during this period. It's much smaller than many comrades would like to believe. And indeed, many of the couple of 100,000 people who came into the party became disillusioned, went off into single issue politics, or simply discovered other interests. And the failure of the Corbyn movement may well have finished many of them off for good in politics. But there still are attempts to, in a sense, revive that. And many of the arguments of comrades about forming new groupings do turn on, in a sense, rekindling the enthusiasm of the Corbyn period. And looking back to that period now, rather nostalgically, it sort of seems to be almost a mixture of, for some comrades, the miners' strike of the 1980s plus Paris in 1968. It has the sort of almost the golden ageism. It seems to be an argument that they want to, rebuild that movement, but in a new form of party. And so there are, to my certain knowledge, at least 3 or 4 new initiatives which have either been flagged as beginning in this autumn or at various stages in the run-up to the election, to form a new workers' party, a new mass workers' party, to draw upon the enthusiasm of Corbynism and the traditions of Labour leftism. Now, the arguments around so-called broad parties, I think, are important. But even in its own terms, even in terms of its own Labour leftism, these attempts, I think, are going to be pretty stillborn. Partly because those forces don't exist in the same way, but also because the perspective of these comrades is, in a sense, to rebuild the Labour Party, to rebuild it in terms of its relationship with the trade unions, but also to rebuild it in terms of its broad reformist, or in many cases even just simply protest politics. And for me and for other comrades who were involved in these currents, they've proven their uselessness, not because of the sort of individual comrades, inability, not because of their lack of enthusiasm, but I think because of their really quite fundamental misunderstandings, both about the nature of socialism, in particular as a project of the self-emancipation of the working class, which requires a complete break with capitalism that doesn't see the state as an instrument, for achieving socialism. So that understanding does mark a very clear gulf between us and even the best of the Labour left. But I think there's also something else that does need to be understood. And maybe the Corbyn movement illustrates this, even though there was something of a long period in British history, British political history, where this wasn't such a key factor. And that is that as long as Labour remains a bourgeois workers' party, as long as it retains those links to the organised working class through the trade unions, then I still think that it will be a site of struggle and still will be an area in which many workers, if they are looking to develop political alternatives, will move. I think there are various reasons, the electoral system, one of them, of course, but also the importance of political tradition and indeed, the strength of that Labourist tradition. Now, that isn't to say that we accommodate our politics to that and develop some sort of, critical support for a Labour government or, Labour to power on a socialist programme, demands of that character. But it does mean that we have to treat the Labour Party seriously. And it does mean that all the while that it retains those forms, then I think it will be, an area that we have to pay attention to. I think the only question that does come to mind is whether the Starmer project, which is to take the Blair project further, whether if that's successful, whether that does represent what we've called before the de-Labourization of Labour and its transformation into something akin to the American Democrats, or whether what that then poses for us and what that then poses for politics. That I think is still unclear about its future. But whatever the direction, Labourism as a form of politics will remain, and one that Marxists have to encounter, and one that Marxists have to confront. And as was the case with the Corbyn movement, one whose not only political orientation, but strategic and above all tactical orientation has to be exposed and has to be combated. I talked really about a lot of my own experiences in this period. And, in a way, during this period, I arrived at a different conception of politics. And I did so simply because it struck me that not only was the official Labour left incapable of taking the fight to the Labour right, but even if, for example, it had purged the Labour right MPs, what sort of party would have been thrown up would not have been a Marxist party. It would have simply been yet, I think, another version of Labour leftism. And given the original sin of Labourism and the nature of that type of politics as representing the workers within the framework of capitalism, that wouldn't have offered socialists or Marxists any real future or any real form of politics. Anyway, comrades, I'll leave it there.